Let me tell you about a woman who learned to expect nothing from this world. I reckon most folks have felt invisible at some point in their lives, standing in a room full of people, wondering if anyone truly sees them. Truth be told, that's a loneliness that cuts deeper than any blade. This story found me years ago, and I've been meaning to share it ever since. It's about a woman named Eliza, who stood on an auction platform in a dusty frontier town, waiting to be chosen or passed over, as she'd been so many times before. And it's about a quiet man named Nathan, who said 4 words that changed everything. There's no magic here. Folks, just 2 people, a little cabin on a hill, and the slow, hard work of learning to trust again. I hope you'll sit with me a while. Some stories are better shared than kept. 17 cracks in the wooden platform. Eliza counted them the way she'd counted cracks in 3 other towns before this one. Dust Creek made 4. The boards beneath her feet had been built for livestock auctions. She could still smell the ghost of manure baked into the grain, mixed with pine tar, and something sour she didn't want to name. The sun pressed down on her skull like a hot iron. She kept her eyes on her shoes, brown leather, worn through at the left toe, the sole separating near the heel. She'd walked 200 miles in these shoes. They'd outlasted 3 marriages that weren't marriages at all. Eliza Bloom, the sheriff read from his paper, dragging out the syllables like he was tasting something unpleasant. 26 years, no children, can cook and clean, been through. He paused, letting the crowd fill in the silence. 3 towns already. Laughter rippled through the square. Eliza didn't flinch. She'd stopped flinching in the 2nd town, when she'd learned that flinching only made them laugh harder. A fly landed on her wrist. She didn't brush it away. The 3 women who'd stood beside her were already gone, chosen within the first 20 minutes. Martha, the pretty one with yellow hair, went to the banker's son. The widow with good teeth went to a rancher from the next county. Even the girl who couldn't have been more than 17 had been claimed by an old farmer with tobacco-stained fingers. Eliza remained. The church bell rang 10 times somewhere behind her. Nobody looked up. "Come on, gentlemen," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying that particular tone men used when they were enjoying themselves. Surely someone needs a woman who knows her way around a kitchen. She ain't much to look at, but she's got strong arms. More laughter. A man in the front row spat tobacco juice onto the dirt, close enough that it splattered the edge of the platform near Eliza's feet. She counted the cracks again. Still 17. The morning had started the way all these mornings started: the creak of the wagon, the smell of canvas and unwashed bodies, the guard unlocking the back gate and telling them to make themselves presentable. As if presentable meant anything when you were being sold like a plow horse. She'd pinned her hair back with the 2 pins she had left, smoothed down her calico dress, the brown one with patches at the hem that didn't quite match. She'd learned not to wear her better dress, the blue one she'd saved from her mother on auction days. Better dresses attracted the wrong kind of attention. "Last chance," the sheriff announced, consulting his pocket watch with theatrical boredom. "Going once for the Bloom woman. Going twice." A murmur moved through the crowd. Eliza didn't look up. Looking up meant hoping. Hoping meant disappointment. Disappointment meant pain she couldn't afford anymore. But the murmur grew louder. People were turning, pointing toward the north edge of the square. She heard boots on packed earth. Slow, deliberate, the kind of walk that didn't hurry for anyone. "Well, well," the sheriff said, and something in his voice shifted, still mocking, but with an edge underneath. Nathan Reed finally comes down from his mountain. What's it been? 3 years. No answer. Eliza stared at her shoes. 17 cracks. Her shoes. The fly was gone now. Looking for a woman to warm that cold cabin of yours. The sheriff's laugh was too loud. "Go on then. Reed, take your pick. Consider it a welcome back gift from Dust Creek." Silence stretched across the square like a held breath. Then footsteps again. Closer now. Eliza could see the shadow fall across the platform, tall, broad-shouldered, blocking the punishing sun. She kept her eyes down, counted the cracks one more time. "I'll take the one on the platform." 4 words, flat. No inflection, like he was ordering feed at the general store. The laughter that followed was different this time, sharper, disbelieving. "Her." The sheriff's voice cracked with amusement. "Reed, that one's been through 3 towns. Must be something wrong with—" "I said I'll take her." For the first time in 4 towns and 3 failed placements, Eliza looked up. "If this story's found you today, I'd be grateful to know where you're listening from. Sometimes the best company is knowing we're not sitting alone." The man standing before the platform didn't look like salvation. Dust coated his shoulders, his hat, the stubble darkening his jaw. His clothes had seen too many miles, shirt faded to the color of old bone, trousers patched at one knee with leather that didn't match. He stood the way fence posts stood, straight, silent, waiting for nothing. Eliza's eyes traveled from his boots, cracked, but clean up to his face. He wasn't looking at the sheriff. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at her. Not the way men usually looked. No hunger, no calculation, no amusement at her expense. Just looking. The way someone might study a horizon before deciding which direction to walk. "You sure about this? Reed?" The sheriff folded his arms, that smile still playing at the corners of his mouth. "She's been returned 3 times, like a lame horse nobody wants." The man Reed didn't answer. He pulled off his leather gloves, 1 finger at a time, and tucked them into his back pocket. Eliza's breath caught. On the ring finger of his left hand, a pale band of skin lighter than the sun-darkened flesh around it. The ghost of something that had once been there, recently removed, or worn for so long the mark had never faded. An old woman near the water trough leaned toward her companion. The whisper carried on the still air. 3 years up on that hill, ever since Margaret. The rest dissolved into the murmur of the crowd. Margaret. Reed stepped closer to the platform, close enough that Eliza could smell trail dust, horse sweat, and something underneath pine soap. Maybe. The kind you made yourself when town was too far. "You can come down now," he said. His voice was low, quiet. The voice of a man who didn't waste words on things that didn't need saying. He extended his hand toward her. No glove. Work-roughened palm. Calluses across the base of each finger. Eliza stared at that hand. 3 towns. 3 men who'd chosen her for reasons she'd learned too late. This one hadn't smiled, hadn't joked with the sheriff, hadn't explained himself to anyone. That either meant something, or it meant nothing at all. She didn't take his hand, but she stepped down from the platform, her worn shoes hitting the packed dirt of the square. And when she looked up at his face again, she saw something that made her stomach tighten. He wasn't surprised she hadn't taken his hand. He'd expected it. The sheriff's desk sat in the shade of the general store's overhang. A small mercy. The wood was cooler than the platform had been. Eliza stood 3 feet behind Nathan Reed while the sheriff unfolded a yellow paper and smoothed it flat with his palm. "Marriage certificate," the sheriff announced, loud enough for the lingering crowd to hear. "Standard territorial form. Sign here. Reed." Nathan took the pen, a goose quill. Its tip split and ink-stained, and scratched his name across the bottom line. His handwriting was small, cramped, like a man who didn't write often but knew how. The sheriff turned the paper toward Eliza. "Your turn, Bloom, unless you want to go back on that platform and wait for a better offer." Snickers from somewhere behind her. She didn't turn to look. The pen was still warm from Nathan's grip. Eliza dipped it in the inkwell and wrote her name below his. The ink bled at the end of the M where the quill caught on a rough patch of paper. Eliza Bloom. For the last time. That's that. Then, the sheriff blew on the wet ink, then folded the certificate and handed it to Nathan. She's your problem now. Read. Don't say I didn't warn you. Nathan tucked the paper into his shirt pocket without looking at it. He turned toward the hitching post where a red roan horse stood waiting, its mane crusted with trail dust but its coat brushed smooth beneath. Eliza followed. What else was there to do? The crowd parted as they walked, not out of respect, but to get a better view. A woman in a blue bonnet clicked her tongue. Two men near the water trough exchanged coins, settling some bet Eliza didn't want to understand. Nathan untied the horse's reins. 3 loops around the post, unwound with practiced hands. You ride, he asked. His voice startled her. She'd expected silence all the way to wherever they were going. Some. He nodded once, swung up into the saddle with the ease of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on his own feet. Then he reached down, offering his hand again. This time Eliza took it. His grip was firm but not tight. He pulled her up behind him in one smooth motion, and she settled onto the horse's hindquarters, her hands finding the back of the saddle rather than his waist. Nathan didn't comment on it. The horse copper. She would learn later turned north without being told, away from the square, away from the sheriff's laughter still echoing off the storefronts, away from the church whose bells had rung 10 times without anyone looking up to pray. The road narrowed quickly outside town. Packed dirt gave way to wheel ruts and wild grass, and the buildings of Dust Creek shrank behind them until they were just dark shapes against the morning glare. Eliza watched them disappear. 3 towns before this. 3 times she'd left a place behind, each time with less than she'd arrived with. A trunk the first time, a carpet bag the second. By the third, just the clothes on her back and 2 hairpins that had belonged to her mother. This time she had even less. Just herself and a piece of paper with her name signed below a stranger's. The horse's gait settled into a steady walk. The road climbed gradually, winding between stands of oak and patches of sagebrush that scraped against Eliza's skirt when the path grew narrow. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper, with an edge of pine coming down from somewhere higher up. Nathan didn't speak. Eliza studied the back of his head, the way his hat sat low, shading his neck, the patch on his right shoulder, stitched with thread that almost matched. Someone had sewn that patch with care, someone who knew what they were doing. Margaret. The name surfaced again, dragged up from that whispered conversation in the square. 3 years on the hill, ever since Margaret. The sentence had never finished. But Eliza could finish it herself. The pale band on his ring finger, the careful stitching, the cabin he'd lived in alone for 3 years, coming down only now, only today, to choose a woman nobody else wanted. The horse crested a small ridge, and the road split ahead. One path continued straight, disappearing into a stand of cottonwoods. The other curved east, climbing higher into the hills. Nathan pulled the reins gently left, the eastern road, toward whatever waited at the top. Eliza's hands tightened on the saddle's edge. The cabin they were heading toward, whose hand had sewn those curtains she would find in the windows, whose clothes still hung in the closet, whose ghost would she be sharing a roof with, and why, after 3 years alone, had Nathan Reed come down from his mountain looking for a replacement? The road climbed for what felt like hours. Eliza lost track of time somewhere between the last farmhouse, a weathered structure with a woman hanging laundry who didn't wave, and the point where the oaks thinned out and the sagebrush took over. The sun had shifted from directly overhead to somewhere behind her left shoulder. Afternoon, then, maybe 3 o'clock, maybe later. Her thighs ached from gripping the horse's sides. The saddle's edge dug into her palms where she held on, and sweat had glued her dress to the small of her back. She hadn't ridden this long since she was a girl on her father's farm, before the fever took him and everything changed. Nathan hadn't spoken since asking if she could ride. She watched his back as the miles passed. The patch on his right shoulder caught sunlight when the road curved west, neat stitches, thread that almost matched the faded fabric. Whoever had sewn it knew their way around a needle. The kind of mending that came from years of practice, not desperation. The road grew rougher. Rocks jutted up through the packed dirt, and the horse picked its way carefully around the worst of them. Without turning his head, Nathan slowed the pace, just slightly, just enough that Eliza's grip on the saddle didn't have to tighten. He'd noticed. She filed that away with the other things she'd noticed, the way he'd offered his hand without expecting her to take it. The marriage certificate folded into his pocket without ceremony. The 3 loops he'd used to tie the horse, the knot of a man who expected to need to leave quickly. The sagebrush grew thicker on both sides of the road. Its smell filled her nose, sharp and medicinal, mixing with the dust kicked up by Copper's hooves. Eliza had never liked sagebrush. It reminded her of the second town, where the man who'd chosen her had a ranch surrounded by the stuff. She'd spent 3 months there before he sent her back, claiming she wasn't suited to ranch life. She'd been suited just fine. She simply hadn't been suited to him. "Reckon we'll make it 4 dark." Nathan's voice cut through the afternoon stillness. Eliza startled slightly, her hands tightening on the saddle before she could stop herself. He didn't turn around, just pointed toward a gap in the hills ahead, where the road curved out of sight. "Creek up ahead. We'll rest the horse." The creek appeared 20 minutes later, a thin ribbon of water cutting across flat rocks, barely deep enough to wet Copper's fetlocks. Nathan dismounted in one fluid motion and led the horse to the water's edge. The animal drank deeply, its sides heaving. Eliza climbed down on her own. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, muscles screaming after hours of unfamiliar strain. She steadied herself against a boulder, hoping Nathan hadn't seen. He was already pulling something from his saddlebag, a tin cup, dented on one side with a rust stain climbing up from the rim. He crouched at the water's edge, filled it, and held it out to her. She took it. The water was cold enough to make her teeth ache, clear enough to see the white granite pebbles at the bottom. She drank until the cup was empty, then lowered it slowly. Nathan filled it again without being asked. This time he drank himself. Quick, efficient swallows, his throat moving in the afternoon light. Eliza set the cup down on a flat rock between them. "Why did you choose me?" The words came out before she could stop them. She'd asked herself the same question 100 times during the ride, turning it over like a stone in her pocket, but she hadn't meant to say it out loud, not yet, not when she still didn't know what kind of man he was. Nathan looked at the creek. The water moved around his boots, darkening the leather. "You need more water." Eliza stared at him. He picked up the cup, rinsed it in the stream, and tucked it back into the saddlebag. Then he pulled out a leather pouch and offered it to her. Inside, strips of dried beef and 3 pieces of hardtack, the kind that could break a tooth if you weren't careful. "Eat something. Still got an hour to go." The question hung in the air between them, unanswered. Eliza took a piece of the hardtack. She bit into it carefully, letting her saliva soften the edge before trying to chew. Nathan ate standing up, his eyes scanning the hills around them like a man who'd learned to watch for things that might be watching back. Eliza chewed her hardtack and studied his profile. The line of his jaw, the way he stood slightly turned, keeping both the road they'd traveled and the road ahead in his peripheral vision. He wasn't going to answer her question. Maybe he didn't have an answer. Maybe the answer was something she didn't want to hear. Or maybe, and this thought settled into her chest like a cold stone, maybe the answer had something to do with the woman whose careful stitches still held his shirt together, whose name had silenced an old woman's whisper in the town square. When they mounted again, Eliza's hands found the saddle edge as before, but this time, when the road turned steep and Copper stumbled slightly on loose rock, her fingers brushed against Nathan's belt, just for a second, just to steady herself. He didn't react, didn't stiffen or pull away, but he slowed the horse again, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted, not quite relaxing, but no longer braced against her presence. The cabin appeared as the sun touched the ridge behind them. One story. Log walls chinked with white clay that had cracked in places. A covered porch running the length of the front, its boards weathered to silver gray. To the left, a small barn with a corral attached. To the right, a chicken coop where a dozen hens scratched in the dirt, their clucking the only sound in the evening stillness. Nathan dismounted and led Copper toward the barn. Eliza climbed down on her own again, her legs steadier now but still aching. She stood in the yard and looked at the cabin where she would live, where she would sleep, where she would learn what kind of bargain she had made. The fence needed painting. White, once, now flaking and gray in patches. Someone had started repairing a section near the gate, new posts standing alongside old ones, waiting for rails that hadn't been added yet. Nathan emerged from the barn without the horse. He walked past her toward the cabin, boots heavy on the porch steps, and pushed open the door. "Ain't much," he said, "but it's dry." Eliza followed him inside. The main room held a table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove against the far wall, and a single window facing the porch. A coal oil lamp sat on the table, its wick trimmed unevenly. The walls were bare except for a set of elk antlers mounted above the stove and a small mirror near the door, its surface spotted with age. The smell hit her first wood smoke baked into the walls, dried herbs hanging from a beam near the window, and underneath it all, something faintly feminine lavender, maybe, or rosewater, old, faded, but still there. Nathan crossed to a door on the left side of the room. He pushed it open and stepped back, making space for her to see. A small room, a single bed with a red-striped wool blanket folded at the foot. The wool gone soft from years of washing. A window looking out over the meadow behind the cabin, its curtains white cotton with simple flowers embroidered along the hem. A wooden chair in the corner, and a trunk at the foot of the bed cedar, from the smell of it, with brass fittings gone green with age. Eliza stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under her weight. Nathan pointed to the door. "Latch works from inside." She looked where he pointed. A simple sliding bolt, oak worn smooth from use. Someone had opened and closed this door many times before. Someone who had needed to lock it from the inside. "It works," Nathan said again. Then he stepped back into the main room and closed the door behind him. Eliza stood alone in the small space. She touched the latch, slid it closed. The wood moved easily. No sticking, no resistance. Someone had oiled this mechanism. Someone had cared whether it worked. She slid it open again. Through the closed door, she heard Nathan moving in the main room. The scrape of the stove door opening, the clatter of wood being stacked inside, the scratch of a match, then the soft whoosh of kindling catching flame. The embroidered curtains drew her eyes. She moved closer, touched the fabric. Cotton, soft from many washings. The white gone slightly cream with age. The stitches were small and even flowers that might have been forget-me-nots, worked in blue thread that had faded to gray, the same careful hand that had patched Nathan's shirt. Margaret. Eliza pulled her fingers back from the curtain. A knock on the door. Not demanding. Just a single rap of knuckles against wood. "Food's ready," Nathan's voice said. "If you're hungry." She was hungry. She hadn't eaten since the hardtack at the creek, and before that, whatever thin gruel they'd served in the wagon that morning. She unlatched the door and stepped into the main room. Nathan had set out 2 tin plates on the table, beans with chunks of salt pork, steam rising from the surface, cornbread that looked like it had been made days ago, dry at the edges but still holding together, The smell of the beans filled the cabin. Onion, bacon fat, something smoky she couldn't name. He sat in the chair closest to the stove, already eating. Methodical bites, the scrape of his spoon against the tin plate, the pace of a man used to eating alone and not wasting time on ceremony. Eliza sat in the other chair. The cornbread was dry but not stale. The beans were hot, and the salt pork melted on her tongue. She ate without speaking. Her spoon clinked against the plate in the quiet cabin, and the fire crackled in the stove, and outside the chickens had gone silent with the coming dark. When she finished, she stood and carried her plate to the basin near the stove. "Leave it," Nathan said. She washed it anyway. The water was cold, pumped from somewhere outside, and her fingers went numb as she scrubbed the plate with a rag that hung from a hook above the basin. When she turned around, Nathan was standing. He took his plate to the basin but didn't wash it, just set it in the water and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Chickens wake at dawn," he said. "You don't have to get up with them." He walked to a door on the opposite side of the room, his room. She understood now and paused with his hand on the frame. "The latch," he said without turning around. "Use it if you need to." Then he stepped inside and closed the door. Eliza stood alone in the main room, the fire crackling in the stove, the coal oil lamp casting uneven shadows across the table. She looked at the door to her room, at the latch that worked, at the curtains with their faded blue flowers. 3 towns, 3 men. Not one of them had ever given her a lock. 2 weeks passed like water over stones. Eliza learned the rhythm of the ranch without being taught. The chickens woke at dawn, their clucking rising with the light. The cow, a brown Jersey with a notch in her left ear, needed milking twice a day. The vegetable garden behind the cabin had gone wild with neglect, but tomatoes still clung to their stakes, and beans climbed the fence posts in tangled green ropes. She worked because her hands needed work, because standing still made her think, and thinking led to questions she couldn't answer. Nathan didn't assign her tasks. He rose before dawn each morning, lit the stove, and left a pot of coffee warming on the iron plate. By the time Eliza emerged from her room, he was already gone mending fences, or checking on the 24 head of cattle that grazed in the upper pasture, or doing whatever solitary men did to fill the hours. The first morning, she'd found the coffee in a tin cup set beside it. Nothing else, no instructions. No expectations laid out like traps. She'd poured herself a cup and stood at the window, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot, and someone had made it for her without being asked. By the 3rd day, she'd taken over the chickens. By the 5th, the cow. Nathan came back one evening to find fresh bread cooling on the table. She'd found flour in the pantry and yeast starter in a crock near the window, and he'd eaten 2 slices without comment before going to his room. "Reckon the coffee's about done," he said the next morning. The first words he'd spoken to her since supper 2 days before. That was how it went. No praise, no criticism, just the quiet acknowledgement of presence. On the 14th day, Eliza found the sewing box. It sat on a shelf in the main room, half hidden behind a stack of old newspapers. Cedar, like the trunk in her room, with brass hinges and a clasp shaped like a leaf. She'd needed thread to mend the hem of her dress. The brown calico was coming apart at the seams after too many washes, and the box had called to her from across the room. Inside, spools of thread in a dozen colors, arranged by shade. Needles of various sizes, stuck into a piece of felt. A thimble, silver, sized for a smaller finger than Eliza's, and carved into the inside of the lid, in letters so small she had to hold the box up to the window to read them. R. Margaret Reed. Eliza closed the box, set it back on the shelf, found a spool of brown thread and a needle, and took them outside to the porch, where the light was better and she didn't have to look at those careful letters. Nathan found her there an hour later. The sun had begun its slow slide toward the western ridge, painting the meadow in shades of gold and amber. Crickets sang in the tall grass beyond the fence. And somewhere in the distance a hawk circled, riding the warm air currents up from the valley. He sat in the other chair, the one with the broken slat he'd been meaning to fix, and pulled a bridle from the bag slung over his shoulder. The leather was cracked near the bit. He worked oil into it with a rag, his fingers moving in slow circles. The smell of the oil mixed with the dry grass and dust, and the evening breeze carried the faint sweetness of wild sage. Eliza pulled thread through the hem of her dress. The needle caught on a thick seam, and she had to work it through with her teeth. "What's the horse's name?" The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. His hands paused on the bridle. "Copper." She nodded, kept sewing. The thread made a soft sound as it pulled through fabric. Nathan went back to oiling the leather. The silence between them had changed over 2 weeks, less like a wall now, more like a room they both occupied without bumping into each other. "Cat in the barn doesn't have a name," he said. Eliza looked up. Nathan didn't meet her eyes. He was studying a crack in the leather near the buckle, his thumb tracing its length. "Calico thing. Showed up last spring. Ears torn up from something coyote, maybe. Or a hawk that missed." She'd seen the cat. It watched her from the hay bales when she collected eggs, its amber eyes tracking her movements with the wariness of an animal that had learned not to trust. "You can name it," Nathan said. "If you want." He stood up, tucked the bridle under his arm, and walked toward the barn. At the bottom of the steps, he paused, his back still turned. "There's mint growing behind the house. Makes decent tea, if you like that sort of thing." Then he was gone, disappearing into the barn's shadow, leaving Eliza on the porch with her mending and the evening chorus of crickets, and a question that had nothing to do with horses or cats or mint tea. The sewing box sat inside on its shelf, MR carved into the lid, the thread arranged by someone who would never use it again. Nathan had kept everything. The curtains, the sewing box, the thimble sized for smaller fingers. 3 years alone on this hill, surrounded by the ghost of a woman whose name he still hadn't spoken out loud. What had happened to Margaret Reed? The 4th week began with Nathan standing in the doorway at dawn. "Need supplies from town," he said. "You can come or stay." Eliza's hands stilled on the bread dough she'd been kneading. Flour dusted her wrists, caught in the fine hairs of her forearms. She looked at the dough, at the window, at the road that led down from the hills toward Dust Creek. 4 weeks since she'd stood on that platform. 4 weeks since the laughter and the spitting and the sheriff's voice reading her name like a list of faults. "I'll come." Nathan nodded once and walked toward the barn to saddle Copper. Eliza washed the flour from her hands, found her headscarf, the one she'd arrived with, gray cotton worn thin at the edges, and tied it under her chin. The mirror by the door showed her a woman she barely recognized. Same brown calico dress, same worn shoes. But something in the face had changed. The hollows under her eyes had filled in. The tight set of her jaw had loosened, just slightly. She didn't know what that meant yet. The ride into town took 3 hours. Eliza sat behind Nathan the way she had that first day, hands on the saddle rather than his waist. But when the road grew steep and Copper stumbled on loose shale, her fingers found his belt without thinking. He didn't pull away. Dust Creek appeared below them as the road crested the final ridge. Eliza's stomach tightened at the sight of the church steeple, the general store, the platform in the square where she'd stood counting cracks in the wood. Nathan tied Copper to the hitching post outside the feed store. "I'll be here," he said. "Take your time." The general store sat 3 buildings down. Eliza walked with her eyes forward, her chin level. People turned to watch. She heard whispers trailing behind her like smoke auction girl, Reed's woman. 3 towns, but she didn't look back. The store smelled of coffee beans and kerosene and something sweet, molasses. maybe, or dried apples. She moved past the counter where the shopkeeper pretended not to see her, past the shelves of canned goods and sacks of flour, toward the fabric section at the back. Blue cotton caught her eye, pale blue with small white flowers, soft enough that it draped over her fingers like water. She'd had a dress this color once, before the second town, before everything changed. She lifted the bolt of fabric, held it up to the light from the window. "Well, well." The voice came from behind her, sharp, familiar in the way nightmares were familiar. Eliza turned. The sheriff's wife stood 3 feet away. Velvet dress, deep green, hair pinned up with tortoiseshell combs. She looked at Eliza the way someone might look at something stuck to the bottom of their shoe. "Auction girl," she said, loud enough that every head in the store turned toward them. "Shopping like regular folk now. Isn't that something?" Eliza's hands tightened on the fabric. The cotton bunched under her fingers. "Does Nathan Reed know you're spending his money?" The woman stepped closer. Her perfume was heavy roses, and something underneath that turned Eliza's stomach. "Or did he finally wise up and throw you out? Wouldn't be the first time you've been returned." Someone near the counter laughed. A nervous sound, quickly stifled. Eliza's face burned. Her throat closed around words that wouldn't come. She should say something, should defend herself. Should her foot caught on a crate she hadn't seen. She stumbled backward, arms wheeling, and her shoulders struck the shelf behind her. Bolts of fabric tumbled down. She tried to catch them, and her feet went out from under her completely. She hit the floor hard. Her elbow cracked against the wooden boards. The blue fabric landed across her lap, and when she pushed it away, she found herself sitting in a puddle of something brown and wet that had leaked from a barrel nearby. Molasses. The sweet smell filled her nose, thick and suffocating. Laughter erupted. Not nervous this time, full and cruel. Eliza looked down at her dress. Brown molasses soaked through the calico, spreading across her lap, dripping from her fingers. Her headscarf had come loose and hung around her neck like a rag. The sticky sweetness clung to her skin, her hair, the palms of her hands. Through the store's front window, she could see Nathan standing by the hitching post, watching, his face unreadable. He wasn't coming in. The laughter pressed down on her like a physical weight. Eliza sat in the puddle of molasses, her dress ruined, her hands sticky and brown. The sheriff's wife stood over her, smiling that satisfied smile. And around them the store had gone quiet except for the snickering that rippled from person to person. Through the window, Nathan still hadn't moved. Something shifted in Eliza's chest. Not anger she'd burned through anger years ago, in the first town, when she'd learned that anger only gave them more to laugh at. This was different. Colder. Harder. She looked down at her molasses-covered hands, at the brown calico dress that had survived 3 towns and 4 years, at the blue fabric that had fallen beside her, still clean, still waiting. The sheriff's wife was still talking, something about trash and knowing one's place. Eliza stopped listening. She put her hands on the floor, sticky, slipping and pushed herself up. Her elbow throbbed where it had struck the boards. Molasses dripped from her skirt, pooling on the wood beneath her feet. She stood. The laughter faltered. Eliza reached down and picked up the bolt of blue fabric. She walked to the counter where the shopkeeper stood frozen. "How much?" she said. "For 3 yards. Her voice didn't shake. The shopkeeper blinked. "Ma'am, you're covered in how much?" 15 cents a yard. Eliza counted out 45 cents from her pocket and placed them on the counter. "Cut it, please." She watched him measure and cut with trembling hands, watched him fold it into a square, took it from him and walked out of the store, with molasses dripping down her legs. Nathan was waiting by the hitching post. He looked at her dress, at the fabric in her arms, at her face. He didn't ask what had happened. He just untied Copper and reached down his hand. Eliza took it. 1 week later, she wore the blue dress back into Dust Creek. She'd sewn it herself, using Margaret's needles and Margaret's thread, sitting on the porch in the evening light while Nathan worked oil into leather beside her. The stitches were even. The hem hung straight. The collar sat flat against her throat. Nathan had looked at her that morning when she'd come out of her room. He'd looked at the dress, at the way the blue matched the forget-me-nots on the curtains in her room. He hadn't said anything, but something in his face had shifted before he turned toward the barn. Now they stood outside the bank, the paperwork complete. The account book read, Mrs. Eliza Reed. Nathan had signed as co-holder. The territory required it for married women, but he'd handed the book to her without looking at it. Her name, in black ink. The sheriff appeared as they stepped onto the boardwalk. He planted himself in their path, thumbs hooked in his belt, that same smile spreading across his face. Well now, Reed. He looked Nathan up and down. Still keeping the auction girl around. Figured you'd have gotten tired of damaged goods by now. Or maybe you got her locked up in the barn when she misbehaves. Nathan's jaw tightened. He started to step forward. Eliza moved first. She stepped past Nathan, past his reaching hand, until she stood directly in front of the sheriff, close enough to smell the tobacco on his breath. I have a name. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. Pardon, Eliza. She held his gaze. Didn't blink. Didn't look away. Reed. The smile flickered on his face. His eyes darted to Nathan, then back to her. My husband is waiting, she said. Excuse us. She walked past him. Didn't look back. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her step stayed steady on the wooden boardwalk. Nathan fell into step beside her, at the hitching post. As he untied Copper's reins, he spoke without looking at her. Fair enough. 2 words. But when Eliza glanced at his face, she saw something there she hadn't seen before. Not quite a smile, but close. The corners of his eyes had softened. Just slightly. Just enough. The moon hung low over the eastern ridge as they rode home. Copper knew the way. His hooves found the familiar ruts in the road without guidance, carrying them up through the stands of oak and past the creek where Nathan had first offered Eliza water. The air had cooled with the setting sun, and the smell of sagebrush drifted up from the valley below, sharp and clean. Eliza sat behind Nathan with her hands resting lightly on his belt. The blue dress rustled against her legs as the horse moved. She'd sewn it with careful stitches, using thread from Margaret's box. And now it was hers. Not borrowed, not given, earned. The cabin appeared as they crested the final hill. Dark windows, cold chimney, but the fence posts stood straight, and the new rails Nathan had finally hung gleamed pale in the moonlight. Nathan led Copper into the barn and unsaddled him in silence. Eliza walked to the cabin alone, pushed open the door, and stood for a moment in the darkness. The smell of cold ash and dried herbs, the shapes of furniture emerging slowly as her eyes adjusted. She crossed to the stove and opened the iron door. Kindling waited inside. Nathan always left it ready. She struck a match, watched the flame catch, added larger pieces of wood until the fire crackled and popped. The smell of pine sap filled the cabin. The kettle sat where she'd left it that morning. She filled it from the pump and set it on the iron plate to heat. Nathan came in as the water began to steam. He sat in his usual chair by the stove, the one with the slat he'd finally fixed last week. The firelight caught the angles of his face, the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his hair at the temples. Eliza poured mint tea into 2 tin cups. She handed one to Nathan and sat in the other chair. The cat patch. She'd named her emerged from somewhere and curled up beneath Eliza's feet. Purring. The fire crackled. Steam rose from the cups. Outside. An owl called once and went silent. That day at the creek, Nathan said. Eliza looked up. He was staring into the fire. his cup untouched in his hands. "You asked why I chose you." She set her own cup down on her knee, waited. "You didn't beg." His voice was low, rough. "Didn't cry. Didn't smile at me hoping I'd pick you." He paused. The fire shifted, sending sparks up the chimney. "You just stood there, like you already knew what you were worth, even if nobody else did." Eliza's throat tightened. She looked at her hands wrapped around the warm tin cup. "Margaret was like that," Nathan said. The name hung in the air between them. First time he'd spoken it out loud since Eliza had arrived. "She got sick. Winter before last." He still didn't look up. "Fever took her in 3 days. Wasn't anything I could do." The fire crackled. Patch shifted under Eliza's chair, settling deeper into sleep. She wouldn't have wanted that room empty forever. Nathan set his cup on the floor beside his chair. "Reckon I should have asked whether you wanted to be chosen at all." Eliza looked at him, at this quiet man who had given her a lock on her door and never once tried to open it. "Reckon you're asking now." Nathan looked at her then. First time all evening their eyes had met. The firelight flickered across his face. And in that light she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not hope exactly, but the willingness to wait for an answer. She stood up, walked to the window where the coal oil lamp sat on its shelf. The wick was fresh, she'd trimmed it that morning, and the glass chimney was clean. She struck a match, touched it to the wick, watched the flame catch and grow until it burned steady and strong. Then she lifted the lamp and set it on the windowsill. The light spilled out across the porch, across the yard, across the meadow where the grass bent silver under the moon, a signal in the darkness. A message to anyone passing on the road below. Someone lived here. Someone was home. She turned back to the room. Nathan sat watching her, his hands still, his face quiet. Eliza walked to her chair and sat down, picked up her cup of cooling tea. Patch stirred beneath her feet and settled again. Outside, the lamp burned in the window. Inside, the fire crackled low. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. There's a quietness that settles after a story like this one. Something tender sitting in the chest. Not quite heavy. Not quite light. Just there. Many of us know what it feels like to stand in a room and wonder if anyone truly sees us. Some of us have carried that weight for years, being passed over, talked about, measured by eyes that never look close enough. And perhaps you know what it means to be chosen by someone who didn't need explanations, who simply saw you and decided that was enough. We don't always get answers to the questions that matter most. We don't always understand why certain folks walk into our lives when they do, or why kindness sometimes arrives wearing work boots and silence instead of pretty words. And that's all right. Some things are allowed to rest without being figured out. Some feelings don't need to be resolved to be real. A lamp in a window, a door with a working latch, a name spoken out loud for the first time. Small things, I reckon. But small things have a way of holding more than they seem. Thank you for sitting with me through the telling. It's been good to have your company.